Well, it's a joy to be here with you on this rainy morning, so we're very excited.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you all.
We love this theme of belief, and we wanted to talk a little bit about our beliefs and how they've shaped our practice. So this is called Architecture and Optimism, and it's about understanding who you are, who we are, and trying to make a choice.
This map, and I don't know that you can see this circle there, is where we've lived together for more than 40 years. It's actually a village. It's part of the center of the city of New York. I mean, we don't have a car, we walk to work, and this is our neighborhood, although it's largely a neighborhood of delis and doormen. But it also has an amazing park there that we're right next to, and we love and enjoy that park. So our studio here was on Central Park South. We moved there in 1981 when things were a lot less expensive. And we basically work in one room, and we've always had the idea that we'd work in one room. It's actually right at street level, so it takes just a moment to get in or get out to a cab or onto the subway.
So if you walk by, we're on the ground floor and you can wave at us.
Yeah. This is an image of the studio on the upper left. As I say, it's actually generally more messy than that. Down below, we think of ourselves as a family. Of course, we're not. Now we're the grandparents. But we like being around all the young people, and we like being together. So we see images of us having a meal together, out celebrating, that happened to be my time that I won the NCAA March Madness poll. And you can see I'm particularly happy there. And then also going out and actually looking at the way we detail buildings. So we want every single person in the studio, and I mean every person, from our guy who looks at the books to the person who greets you at the door, to come out and be with us on these trips, because it's critical we all know one another.
So we thought we would take you a little bit also on their neighborhood. So the first thing you saw was our studio, and the second thing you'll see is this place where we lived and brought up our son. So you all know Carnegie Hall Studios, of course, the Carnegie Hall rather, because it's a great place for performance. But what you may not know is that adjacent to the performance hall, there were all of these studios that were built for artists to work and live.
Work and live, and in fact, at early 70s, I found out you could live there. Architects could live there, so I thought, why not have a studio above Carnegie Hall? And the first 2 years I was alone, and I had no work, and so perfectly polished my studio and eagerly waited for work that never came. They eventually said, hey, somebody has to leave the top floor there. Would you like to go up? And you got to find a friend. And so a friend and I, actually 2 friends and I, moved into the very top floor, which was a ballet studio, and then lived there for 40 years. Just a few days before we left, I decided we should do a drawing of the space we lived in. It's less than 900 square feet. And that literally was our home for that period in this small village. What you could see is that we took 2 elevators to the floor below and then walked up a metal fire stair, took off our shoes there, and then opened the door. My bike is behind the door. We're now in the living room, which used to be our studio. There's a dining room there, which actually was a door cut down and painted, a bathroom, a kitchenette with a 2-burner hot plate, under-counter refrigerator, and a microwave, and then a room, and then a tiny room 4x7 for our son, Kai, who is there. And you can look there in the middle of the screen. There are 2 little squares. That's the window we made for our son's room, so he could look through those squares out to Central Park. So we kept him in a closet. Let's be clear. But it gave us more space as a family. The living room's more important.
This is our backyard, so we could go out the fire door, and it wasn't very safe, but we had great views.
Actually, for the first years, there wasn't even a railing there. We just go out and walk on the roof. And I spent actually time with my son up on the top of that water tank there every once in a while. This is the stuff of our lives, which is the stuff, some of it very, very ordinary, others of it special. But we like to collect things. Architects like things. We love things. We would climb up that rung ladder every night for 40 years to our bed, which is that bed right there with just a sheet and if you slipped off the end, you fell about 10 feet. You were a little too active in bed, you might hit your head. But at any rate, it's the place I wanted to live the rest of my life. But we're all removed. There's our son who grew up.
He came back for a guest appearance before. So
it was fine when he was 1, 2, 3, 4. At about the age of 15, he said, I think I'm going to move out if you don't mind. I'm going to go to school somewhere else. There were no doors in the apartment except the bathroom door.
But actually, of course, the place where you live really changes the way you think about space, and that's very much what we do. But we really do believe that architecture is about optimism, because you are building something for other people, and you want that to make other people's lives better.
One thing Billie and I have done is kind of made a pact together about the kinds of things we want to do and the values we want to have in the work. We're going to show 5 projects today and talk about how they are each generated. And I can say that the way we generate our projects is almost always the same. We always work together, I should say. The first one is the American Folk Art Museum, which was finished in 2001 and then lasted for 11, actually 12, even 13 years. Folk art, as you can see in the image, is both traditional art that's made by people who've never been trained in art, but who are really artists, and then those who today were considered outsider artists. But all people have not been trained, and it's a work that is both refined and emotional.
This sort of composite photograph shows the site, and it was very small. So the little white rectangle is the size of the site, which is about 35 feet wide, 100 feet deep.
Unfortunately, we didn't. And the early sketches, and we always start our projects with sketches and ideas. An idea behind this was that it would be a vertical museum, a little like a very compressed Guggenheim, where everything was squashed together and you would move up through the space with your senses, or move down through with your senses. It actually didn't work out that way, but these are early images from, I guess, around 1997. We still draw this way today.
And this is Todd's sketch for those of you who understand architecture. The first one is a section, so it's a cut through the building. It's trying to show this big belly of space that has stairs in it and a skylight that brings light down. So we're trying to say, in a certain way, like a kind of Guggenheim in a shoebox, that there's light always in the center and you walk around the light.
And the model of the building, and then the building that was there, it was a building that we dearly loved, the Museum of Modern Art. The folk art, actually, ambitions were too great for their small site, and the Museum of Modern Art bought it and have torn the building down. But we were working there with designers, exhibit designers, Ralph Applebaum, associates who were working with us on the Presidential Center. It was very much a museum of the senses where things were packed in, and it was an emotional and interesting space where every little bit counted.
I think what we were interested in is a combination of the common and also the sort of special. I think folk art we felt very close to because it was very much about a direct expression of what's inside your heart and your head.
And the ordinary things that we always collected anyway. So everything, it was a museum that felt very, very close to our hearts. One of the qualities of the surface of the museum was its panels, which we had this idea and ultimately were able to realize it, that if you took a very, very expensive material type, white bronze in an ingot form, and then melted it and then poured it into an open form, you could create very, very interesting patterns and panels, and you can see us working at the factory. We didn't do this ourselves, but we certainly worked on the test ideas of the panels, which were made of a white bronze called Thomasville. What was interesting is that as it cooled, like pancakes or any food that you cook, it achieves its own interesting surface, organic surface.
Yeah, so those are Todd's knees, and you can see what a careful person he is. We all balance each other, so I'm the careful person in the back.
Early test panels of the material, and then the building, soon after it was made, they began to weather and darken in their color, but we always liked the irregularity and the sort of humanity that the panels felt like they were handmade, even though they were not. It was a kind of building that was a little brooding, yeah, and we liked the brooding emotional quality of the building.
So this was actually taken relatively close to right before the building was torn down.
Yeah, kind of street shot of a little child finding fascination in the crevices of the surface.
I'm sure his father was an architect and forced him to do that.
But not working for us. Okay, so that's now the void that exists. Is actually a new building is coming up now. One thing that is true in cities is that we're constantly being replaced. So we need to accept change and we need to embrace change. And although that was painful and things are painful, we actually need to believe in the beauty of change. So the second project is the Center for the Advancement of Public Action in Bennington, Vermont.
So it's a very beautiful campus, very green, and we chose a site, and you can see it's outlined in red, that was off to the sort of side of the campus adjacent to a pond.
This is a drawing, sort of combination drawing of an early study where we thought if we put their building behind another building, that was this jagged white building at the bottom is the art center, and it happened to be the delivery side of the art center. We thought if we could correct problems while making our new building, it would be better than picking an even more pristine site. So this is early studies, our eventual site plan, working with our landscape architects. The building increasingly, as we work through projects, they inevitably become simpler.
So the Center for the Advancement of Public Action is a building that's dedicated to bringing people to the college to talk about important issues of the time. So it is a place for some of those people to stay for a few days. It's a seminar room, it's meeting spaces, and it's also a place where students can plan what they're going to do on their semester off. So they go out into the community and then they try to sort of attack or focus on a particular issue.
So Bennington, Vermont has bed and breakfast, but they wanted the visitors to stay right with the students. They needed a number of seminar rooms. The students were self-determined their programs. We put the faculty offices in that area. We created 5 or 6 different seminar spaces that would be useful. What we realized in Vermont is we looked around trying to figure out how were we going to make this building, thinking, well, you know, we have some interest in materiality. We looked down at the church and we can see us standing there, me pointing at the stones and saying, wow, these are cool. What are these stones from? And we found out later that they came from Rutland, Vermont, about 50 miles away, and that they were the waste stones that are used for headstones in Arlington or for repairing Capitol buildings. And there are very few of these. They're hardly used anymore because we're not making marble buildings so much anymore. But this stone was virtually free, owned by a single person with a single saw. And we said, well, maybe we could use this waste material to become the outside of the building. The building had a kind of sense of nobility in this small campus, and we thought the purpose was noble. Maybe it should feel a little noble.
Well, what was also interesting, if you look in the slide with the 2 buildings, is this is in that quarry, and they simply took stones from every single different quarry after they had bought up the stones and put them together. So they're very mixed, and we thought that's a really interesting idea for a building. I mean, Todd had said when he was looking at the folk art slide, that we actually like this idea of inconsistency, of showing the sort of broad range of potential materials.
So this is a quite persuasive image because it snows in Vermont, and the building is kind of white. It's on a sloping piece of land, so we leveled off the top of the buildings, but it looks quite pretty in the summertime too, against the green. So we see it as a kind of an acropolis, 3 buildings that create a place in the land in this farm, this rural area.
And there are times when we use some of the very large stones. You can see it in the corner of one of the buildings, rather than cut it up, because we thought it was very beautiful to see the marks that had happened when the stone was cut maybe 50, 75, 100 years ago.
Well, you can, looking further into that image, you see green. Go back, Billy. You can see green through the long building there, and that actually is a residence. We sort of like the idea that students could actually be walking out to the countryside, walking right by the residences. In other words, proximity, rubbing against things that were unexpected, was very important, and I think that's true with all of our work. We like it together. We said that it would be a primary symposium space, and we likened it to the UN, a small UN space, or maybe a surgical room in this case, where everybody is really focused on what's going on in the center. And of course, it's not either of those things, but it actually does have an interesting sense. It can easily hold 10 people in a conversation in the central table, or take up to 100 people in a larger conversation. Courtyards don't necessarily, and classrooms don't necessarily have to be inside in a cold space, as long as you stop the wind. We know that here in the Chicago, windy city, although it's raining today. If the wind were blowing and the sun were out, you'd be very happy to be in an enclosed outdoor courtyard, which is the case in the center of the building. We take all the snow, gather it, drain it into the center, clean it, and send it back into the pond nearby.
This long, narrow building is a series of places for people to stay, for visiting scholars, and we made it a combination of places that you could share with somebody else, or single.
This is just like the apartment we wanted to live in. We Calbert's children, but we did take them to our apartment and said, hey, wouldn't it be cool to live in a place like this? And they said, well, maybe. And so we actually did something that was as weird as our own home, but done much better. At any rate, we loved making these residences. Each of the rooms was different, and they could combine in different ways, depending. I had an idea of a seminar space that was a little like the Pantheon, but very compressed, where you would allow the rain to come in and drain through the floor. And that became, and you could crank the roof open or by hand or close it. And it becomes a place where students can go 24/7 anytime they're on the campus. So it's a kind of spiritual place and a place for great music, and sort of made just by the students. Of course, we've done this project. Another project that was important and feels connective to the work we're doing here is the Lafrac Center at Prospect Park. You know, we live on Central Park. That's Olmsted and Vox. And Prospect Park is a park done by Olmsted and Vox just 10 years later after Central Park. And guess what? Your park right here, Jackson and Washington Parks, were done just after that. So it's interesting that we have projects and our life on 3 of Olmsted and Vox's parks.
So this is an image that shows the completed project, but you can see it in relationship to Manhattan, but you can also see it more importantly in relationship to the entire park, because this corner of the park was underused and was not taken care of properly.
There's an interesting problem here. This is the plan of the 1867 of Olmsted and Vox. They expected this corner of the park to be for the common folk, and they had a carriage concourse, and they created an artificial lake there, artificial topography, an island called Music Island. You can see that in the center. And they imagined that the people would row on the lake and that they would skate on the lake, and this would be an active place for the least affluent people, and that did happen for a few years. until they decided people shouldn't skate on that lake. They would fall through. And eventually it fell into disuse, and Robert Moses took that carriage turnaround and made a 300-car parking lot. You can see it right in the center. And then he also made an ice skating rink destroying Music Island. And so from 1961 until our project was done, this was a new loved place. People parked down in the parking lot, barbecued in there, and then used the ice skating rink during the wintertime because it was an outdoor ice rink. They asked us to make an indoor rink there, and we said, no, let's not do an indoor rink. And let's, by the way, get rid of the cars. So we built 2 rinks exactly in the site of the parking lot. We restored Music Island there, and we built the largest building in Prospect Park, 30,000 square foot building that is a kind of recreation center for the park.
But one of the things we did, and you see that there's a rectangle there, and that's actually a green roof, which is over a hockey rink that's sized for hockey, is that we brought earth over the top of the buildings that we put in the park. So it's very easy for you to be running along a path in the park, and it will take you over the top of a building and down. And you may not even know that it's there. And that's one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot when we think about what's going to happen in Jackson Park.
Well, we think about taking a program like we did in Bennington and breaking it apart. So the land is somehow the binder between things. Land is more important than buildings, in our opinion. And even the ice skating rink, they wanted 1 ice skating rink. We made it into 2, one for recreation and one for hockey, and we allowed them from time to join together. So this is the plan of the building. It's been wildly successful, I should say. It wasn't the reason Brooklyn's has come up, but it has been one of the reasons that Prospect Park is in fabulous shape today.
But we're proud of this project because it's so public. You do have to pay to get on the ice, but you don't have to pay to enjoy what's all around it. There's a place for coffee. There are now great, clean public restrooms in a corner of the park where there weren't. And there's a kind of interesting topography that also happens, a sort of hillside.
So that's the image of the building, which is just a floating roof. A very tall, large floating roof, which protects the ice. On a day like today, it would be cold enough as long as it didn't rain on that ice. So the hockey rink is protected from the rain. Here we are, once again, trying to find where's the stone we would use for this. We found out that we could get very inexpensive stone that looked like Manhattan schist from Canada. So we went to the quarry. You go to the quarry to find the best stone, just as you go to the farmer to find the best vegetables. And you learn about it, how it's cut. This happens to be used for curbing. They just chop it, so it's very, very crude stone, and it comes from Canada at low cost. So we used the chopped stone for our buildings, and you chose a darker stone so it would be more recessive in the park, and the park would come to life.
So we really wanted it to feel like walls in a park rather than a building in a park. And many of the walls in Central Park are made out of a very rough cut stone. So although this is a building, there are plants growing on top, and it also feels very much like a wall in the park.
Well, these marks on the roof are fake. The lights are not. The marks we thought would be we could put lights in that we didn't have the money, so we just carved into the ceiling about this deep and then painted it with silver paint. And the lights would shine on the ice, reflect onto the ceiling, and make it look like those are lights. So the ordinary lights, if all the lights are on, it's super bright. If half the lights are on, it looks like a starry night. And if the even lights in a grid, and if you look carefully, you can see they're gridded out, can provide proper lighting for ice skating, for hockey, which is the case. This is the summertime use, which is a roller rink, and they do films here and dances and stuff. And then next door, the ice skating rink, which in the summertime is recreational outside, becomes a water play.
And this is free. And this is that relationship we were talking about where there's a park on top of a building. So those people who are with a stroller might not realize that there's a cafeteria below them. This is the top of the
green roof.
The green roof.
And here we can look at the relationship of the ice skating rinks to the lake beyond. And the whole edge of the lake has been restored. The Barnes Foundation is another thing. Actually, this issue of activating our parks is one of the, I think, the most important things we can do, because parks are democratic, parks are free, and parks are a democratic space just as sidewalks are. We need to love our parks, we need to love our sidewalks, we need to love our libraries. So this project in the Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia has been a happy success story.
So those of you who don't know about the Barnes collection, it was the collection of one man named Albert Barnes. And he essentially was very, very interested in Impressionist art and amassed a private collection which he kept in a house museum in Marion, Pennsylvania, which is a very, very beautiful, very exclusive suburb outside of Philadelphia. Here he's shown with John Dewey. So he had a belief about his collection, which was that it was an educational tool.
And the other aspect of this is that his wife, Laura Barnes, was a horticulturalist and loved nature and loved gardening. So it's kind of a combination, but we're going to focus on the Barnes' collection and the building in Marion, which housed that collection. There are over 2,000 works of art that Barnes meticulously organized in ensembles, trying to, in a way, use the paintings and the form, line, color of the paintings to be juxtaposed against one another. So one didn't need to know anything about art to find relationships. In fact, my grandson at the age of 6 could easily find relationships with the paintings in the collection by just looking at things and saying, wow, that looks like that. What's going on in these two things? And I think that meant that Barnes was able to educate any person through this method. You didn't have to be rich or educated, and that was an important principle. He also believed that ordinary things like hardware were there, so we kind of liked this because it also put ordinary stuff there. And he also was the first collector of African art, seeing that it was not just anthropological information, but it was also actually art in itself.
So, I mean, this really ties back to even the way we put together our stuff in Carnegie Hall, or thinking about folk art as well. It's about a very direct connection with art that doesn't have to come from necessarily education about the sort of provenance of various pieces. So this is the Franklin Parkway, and it is the main civic thoroughfare of Philadelphia. And at the far end is the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
And other buildings that were built in the 20s until the and early 30s, basically, the Franklin Institute being the last one, just after the crash occurred. The Barnes Foundation was given a site there, actually the place of a youth detention center, which is a sad place as part of the park, and actually brought down the level of the quality of the park when we met that site back in 2006 or so. This is the youth detention center as it's being torn down. The park was unloved at that location. Unfortunately, the kids too much unloved, really housed in a 1950s building of some interest if it were not on the parkway, but no interest on the parkway. There were protests. We got in all sorts of trouble by supposedly accepting that we were going to break Dr. Barnes' will by bringing it into the city. But Barnes always believed that his collection should be for the people, and we simply accepted the ruling. Ultimately, happily, all of these protesters, I would say, are now fans because it's truly changed the city and improved the safety and security and the beauty of the collection.
But what did allow the foundation to move the collection was that we needed to keep the ensembles intact. So those rooms and the way the paintings are hung were really we needed to reproduce that sense. In an early sketch, we showed the gallery in a garden, because that's what the Barnes Foundation was in Marion. And we said when it moves to downtown Philadelphia, it should be taking with it that sense of a garden. Could you bring that sense of a garden into the gallery? And so here you see the Franklin Parkway. At the far end, you see the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is a neoclassical building with the stairs going up to the top. And our building is both a participant in the architectural language of the Parkway, but also says that it is a new arrival.
I should say this, among other things, has totally transformed Philadelphia. Working with Laurie Olin, the great landscape architect, we imagined that you should, like in Marion, you should actually walk, and at Prospect Park, we should walk through the park to get to the building. And in this case, there's a kind of civic plaza that Laurie and we designed with a 150-foot long reflecting fountain, but it's really not, it's open, all of the site is open to the public at all times. We worked thinking about the facade. Barnes collected African fabrics, so we took cues from the collections and said that maybe we should, in a way, wrap the building with stone, imagining stone was a little like fabric, a kente cloth, for example. And in the end, on the lower right, you see the stone. We once again said, where do we get the stone at low cost? And we found out that we could get very, very interesting warm stone that felt like it belonged in the Parkway from Israel, actually from the Negev, and went there and visited the quarries and learned how the stone was quarried and how it could be chiseled, worked, and ultimately the building becomes these panels of stone that came actually from the Negev, then went to Bethlehem to be worked and then brought to Philadelphia and put on the building. So it feels like it belongs, and it feels handmade, and it is handmade. This is a drawing Billie did of an African cloth fabric on the top band. It's a lyre's cloth pattern. She did it freehand and pen, and then they created a mosaic. So the African material and textures come into the building. These fabric on these couches that we designed come from Senegal.
So this is the kind of garden space, and the sort of technical drawing you see is a section through the skylight. But what it does is it brings in natural light that changes and shifts throughout the day. This is a drawing, a sketch that Todd did of a gate that closes down the gallery section. It's also based on an African motif. And this is actually a gallery that was created off-site where we could study the details of the gallery spaces, because we're essentially modernists and we're not used to dealing with so many different kinds of moldings. So what we tried to see is what existed and what we could do to make it feel connected to the past, but also feel present in the present. So what you see on the darker sort of side is what was existing, and this is how we changed it. And many people came in and felt we had actually completely replicated the galleries, but actually every single detail was looked at and slightly shifted, made simpler, and we had a kind of mantra which was simplify and intensify.
Yeah.
So this is a new gallery.
Which is a kind of a mantra we have as we develop our work. I mean, how can we make something rich and varied, but also not have it be cloyingly old-fashioned?
This is a study center, and this is a way that they are now using the light court. This is a dance class. This is the Trisha Brown Company performing there. This is a changing exhibits gallery. And then this is, somebody sent us this image of...
It's not, the Swans haven't taken this over. This is for an opera that was performed there. And these are plastic swans, but we quite like the fact that our something we thought was so pristine could actually be taken over by an art piece. So I wish those would sort of stay there all the time, although maybe not.
I was very worried that it was real swans and swan poop all over the place. We're down to our final 5 minutes.
Yeah. And the final project we wanted to talk about was the Presidential Center here. And we'll quickly go through that. We also presented the President and First Lady when we met them with this as an idea, which was that as a young organizer here in Chicago, he was basically enabling people and empowering people. And we believe that has been his mission, and we know that will be his mission. We also saw that the president, by being the first black president in America, ennobled the presidency and ennobled all people, knowing that they could achieve the highest place in the land, the presidency.
I have to tell you, they are as amazing in real life as you would imagine and hope that they would be. Sorry, that was...
So in this same way, storytelling is in a way making an image, a story bigger, the nightlight, and turning a dog into a very large dog. But story making is where everyone puts up their hand and gets to work and is part of making the stories. And we think that those two things relate very much to that. And so the Presidential Center will be both about storytelling and people making stories. The president believes every single person's story counts, and that's an amazing quality. And if every person's story counts, then, and we can recognize the beauty of each story being different, we know that a community can be made of people who are very, very different one from another. So this is the intentionality of the project. And
so one of the things that presidential libraries have always been has been about storytelling. In many ways, that's about the past and enshrining the past. And we need to have that aspect. But the larger aspect, and what makes this different from all other presidential libraries, is that the majority of the emphasis is going to be put on story making. It's about the future. It's about how we can help people envision and make a more positive future. So the first part is making a kind of landmark, because there needs to be something that is there as a kind of object of pilgrimage.
And then adding to that, if we use the landmark and then add together two other buildings, we can actually make a destination. So once again, we've taken that same formal idea, which is to take one program and pull it apart to engage the landscape. So that's our idea. We were studying both the Washington Park site and the Jackson Park site. We did designs for each of them, as the 7 competitors did. The site that was chosen was in Jackson Park. You know that site. That red outline actually is exactly where the horticultural building of the World's Fair was in the 1890s. Jackson Park is what I now know is the most amazing thing, is that Olmsted and Fox designed these 2 parks, but the real emphasis on the entire idea behind Olmsted and Fox's park was, Lake Michigan. And today, with your incredible chain of parks, you are actually uniting and honoring the entire water's edge and the lake itself reflecting the city. So if one can bring additional energy to the south side in the park, we think that it'll be a way by which we can really change the city.
So there are 3 aspects, as Todd said, really 4. The plaza is going to be the 4th part. It's the space in between. There's the building, which is the museum. There's a forum, which is where all of those programs will happen: classrooms, theater, place for coffee. Really, it's the sort of heart of the complex, and then a branch of the Chicago Public Library. So the actual papers of the archive will be digitized, and you'll be able to access them online, but there will be the public library branch as part of the whole Presidential Center.
So that's an idea of bringing the site to life, acknowledging that books are still good. Stop, Billy. Go back, please. And these 3 buildings are actually not 3 buildings, but it's rainy and cold sometimes in Chicago. So they're actually one large building below ground. And that building is pierced with courtyards, so that at 20 or 25 feet below grade, you're constantly able to find yourself next to a garden. And thus the 3 buildings, which seem to be separate and which allow people to pass into the park through the buildings and making it all public, are actually one. The museum element is the landmark, the sort of icon, the figure that signals. And I should say this model, we are not finished with schematic design. I should tell you, we won't be done at least until the new year. We've been working for a year and a half, and the museum The tower element is still a tower element. That's a signal, an icon. It's a little clunky here. It's a lot clunky here. Hopefully it'll get better. But the elements are basically are more or less intact, and each of them is in a vulnerable place, ready to receive the critique of the people that we're slowly discussing this with, not only the President and First Lady, who are really, this is their scheme, their project, but the foundation members and the community members and people who will be visiting. So there is a public plaza. In this earlier version, it looks a little too much like it actually is the same size as the Millennium Plaza. It's also the same size as the Campidoglio in Rome. It's actually the same size as the Bethesda Fountain Plaza in Central Park. There's an exhibit space. Part of the building will, in fact, be relatively opaque because there will be at least 4 floors of exhibits that will tell the stories. That's the storytelling. People are interested in the stories that are told.
But most of the presidential center will be unticketed. That means it will be free. So the exhibit space will be ticketed. It is a museum space, but the ground floor space and the lower floors are all going to be open and free to all people.
Well, he and they loved having performances in the White House and believe that the theater is a great place for expression. Recording studio is a great place for expression. There's a symposium, or there are a number of symposia that will be there. Workspaces, he says, there need to be labs because there's work to be done, and I don't know what the work is. It could be community based, or it could be globally based. So there are workspaces and labs. There's the public library. There are these courtyards that bring life to the lower level. There are the passageways that allow, like our project in Prospect Park, people to seem to feel and actually feel that the park is all theirs. We're removing the 3.5, we're removing Cornell Drive, just as we remove parking through there. It does mean we have to put those cars, make them move comfortably and quickly through the city, so there's work to be done on the other roads, but there's no reason at this park, which has this wonderful drive, and I've driven it from Michigan up and from Chicago down, but I'm sorry, it actually disrupts the park and makes it less park-like and less accessible to the community. So we're getting rid of that. The final image is this, and this comes from our studio. We actually saw that this is a building that the tower is a building that's made by many hands. It's a tower that holds the light and the life inside, and that symbolizes what we think is the light of hope for the future.
So I'm just going to end by a few lines from Marge Percy, who's a poet, and this is an amazing poem called To Be of Use. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands and crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums. But you know, they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. Thank you.
We're now going to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll come to you. Excuse me. I'm going to come right here. Could I be stand, please? Thank you.
Question about parking and public transportation to the new Obama Library.
Yes. Well, public transportation in Chicago should always be better. And we are, at least at the present, committed to parking 400 cars out of sight and beneath the ground so that they're not evident. I don't really want them to be fully buried, but that's something we're working on because when you fully bury cars, you bury their mechanical systems. And if there's some way, like other work we've done, to inventively make a humane garage, but make sure that the park is primary. That would be the ideal. We've imagined that it would be on an unused part of the Midway, and we're studying that as well as other options. But the road system will have to be improved to take the cars off that now go down on
Lakeshore.
Cornell, and they need to be diverted, and Lakeshore Drive will probably receive another lane going south, and other roads will need to be smoothed and the traffic eased to make sure that there's less traffic slow-ups as people move from the south side to the north. So we're working on that. As I say, we are not even done with schematic design. These images of the building that we've got are now 6 months old, and I can tell you many versions revised as we listen to people and try to solve these problems. Yes, well,
Is mine on yet?
are we to be pointing?
Over here.
Okay, I'm not.
Back here. What's the division of labor and responsibility in your creative development of a project between you?
I didn't.
What's the division of labor and responsibility?
As you create a project, what does each of you do?
How would you define our roles as we work on a project?
When we decided we'd be partners, and when we became formally partners in 1986.
He's going to be in a little trouble later on.
Yeah, or not. I'm trying to work through this thing. I had 10 years of additional experience to Billie. She came to work for me. But when we decided to be partners in '86, we decided everything should be divided equally and that the roles were equal. They are not equal because we're so different, but we always work on all projects together, so I would say that 50% is exactly the way it splits. Now, what is 50%? Do you credit more to deep thinking? Or do you credit more to nuts and bolts? I mean,
that's a very bad diagram.
Well,
I mean,
there are diagrams that are real. They're not always, they shouldn't be polarized like that, but let's be clear. There's some division along those lines, as there are between men and women a lot of times.
No, I think the way we work together is that we have the same goal. And so we have the same values, we have the same beliefs, but how you get to that goal is different. And so that's why we don't we do butt heads, but we don't butt heads that much. I think Todd's very interested in a kind of three-dimensional molding of space. I'm very interested in a kind of what is the sense of that place. We move through our own channels to the same end place.
And because we work in a community and we work with a community, every voice counts. So to say that it's our work is just ridiculous. It's just, we are the catalysts and we are, I think, the drivers of the vision of the studio, but we hardly do the work. I mean,
without the studio, nothing would happen.
And without clients, we would be nowhere. So.
I'm unclear about the concept for the Obama Library. You talk quite a bit about underground.
Yes.
What are we going to see above the ground?
Well, I think there will be an iconic, that's ridiculous. There's a tall building, okay? Which should be identifiable and is not a glass tower. Let's be clear, it's not a commercial-looking venture, and we want it to be identifiable as a positive symbol that looks both south to the community and west to the community and looks north and east. It should feel luminous and positive. Otherwise, I would say you see one-story buildings from the plaza side, and from the other side of the park, for example, from the water side or the island side, you will actually not notice there are buildings at all. There actually will be, if we count the garage as a building, if we count the president wants an athletic center as a building. He plays basketball, but he believes that there is important social work to be done by teamwork and empowering young men, but the First Lady believes there's dance. They will be, as we negotiating for that space. So there will be those, that's another structure that we didn't show, but that should not be really visible in the park. And then there are the forum and the library, and those should not be visible in the park. The only thing that should really be significant and visible would be the taller tower, which is quite clear, the plaza, and then the two buildings, or the three buildings that line the plaza.
Yeah, from Stony Island, you will see these buildings and the plaza. There'll be a lot of trees. And it will be a very green but open space. From the water side, because the earth will come over those buildings, they're quite tall one-story buildings, but the earth will come over the top of them, as they did in the Prospect Park project of the skating rinks. You actually won't see, you won't have a sense of presence of the buildings from the park side.
And actually, interestingly, if we look back to Olmsted and Vox's writing, even about this park, they imagined mounds to be created, but they were destroyed and the parks were not realized by the dreams they originally had. So we can see the writing. We don't have the drawings, but we certainly saw that in both Prospect Park and Central Park. That lake in Prospect Park is entirely artificial, as are many of the topographic changes. So our idea is that if we can actually make the buildings fit into the park without disturbing the park, we can give back more public space to the people who use the park. It'll be a win-win.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I just wanted to say, one, I have a son named Todd who is an architect in Manhattan. And I was in Prospect Park last week, and unfortunately I didn't see your center, and I'm curious, exactly where is it in Prospect Park? What was that street at the bottom of one of your drawings?
The question is, where is it?
Where is it in Prospect
It's
Park?
actually in the very farthest corner of the park. It used to be, anyone old enough to remember Ebbets Field? But at any rate, it's way up in that far corner of the park, which is the furthest one from Manhattan. So if you go to the park and you're closer, let's say, to the museum in Manhattan, you'll be at the very farthest corner. But if you're by the lake, it's right on the edge of the lake, and it's only that it's not that visible because, in fact, it's just a kind of a line and a blue ceiling. So, yeah, I hope you find it one day. But you know,